living in 2025, I get anxious when my phone dies and I can't check the time. But imagine living in a world where "I'll meet you at 3 o'clock" wasn't even a phrase people used. Medieval folks had a completely different relationship with time, and honestly, it sounds both terrifying and oddly relaxing. Back then, being fashionably late wasn't really a thing because, well, how could you be late when nobody knew what time it was? The closest you'd get to setting up a meeting would be something like, "I'll see you when the church bells ring for evening prayer," or "Let's meet when your shadow is as tall as you are." It's kind of like telling your friend today, "I'll be there after my cat finishes her nap." Technically a time frame, but not exactly precise. Time measurement was still crucial, though, especially for medieval monks who needed to pray at specific times throughout the day. Merchants also needed some way to track time for their business dealings. The lack of precise time measurement created some pretty interesting situations. There are actual court records from medieval England where people argued about whether a crime happened before or after the cock crowed. Imagine trying to use your neighbor's rooster as evidence in court today. And here's a fun tidbit. In some medieval towns, the official timekeeper could be fined if they rang the town bells at the wrong time. Talk about a stressful job. But perhaps the most surprising thing about medieval timekeeping was how relaxed people were about it. Without the constant pressure of exact minutes and seconds ticking by, life moved at a different pace. They didn't have that modern panic of, "Oh no, I'm 5 minutes late." Instead, they lived by the rhythms of nature and their communities. Speaking of nature's rhythms, one of the most reliable ways medieval people kept track of time was by watching the sun move across the sky, which brings us to one of their cleverer inventions: sundials. This is basically just fancy sticks that tell time, but these fancy sticks were absolute game changers for medieval folks who had already mastered the art of following the sun's daily dance across the sky. The basic concept was brilliantly simple. Stick a pole, which is called a gnomon, in the ground, and its shadow would move as the sun traveled overhead. Medieval craftsmen took this simple idea and ran with it, creating some seriously impressive devices. Sure, they weren't as precise as your smartphone, but they could tell you if it was roughly time for lunch. And let's be honest, that's what really matters, right? Some medieval sundials were so precisely engineered that they could track time down to 15-minute intervals. Not bad for something that's essentially a glorified stick in the ground. The really fancy ones even had different markings for different seasons, because the sun's path changes throughout the year. Medieval scientists weren't playing around. They were basically the original tech nerds. The most common type was the horizontal sundial, which you'd typically find in monastery gardens or town squares. But medieval Europeans got creative with their designs. They had vertical sundials on church walls perfect for those "oh no, am I late for mass?" moments, portable sundials for traveling merchants medieval, which is equivalent to a wristwatch, and even ring dials that you could wear around your neck like some ancient bling. Speaking of monks, they were particularly obsessed with accurate sundials because their whole day revolved around specific prayer times. Imagine being the monk who had to explain to the abbot why everyone missed morning prayers because your sundial calculations were off. "Sorry, boss, I forgot to carry the one when calculating the equinox adjustment." That wouldn't fly very well in a medieval monastery, but sundials had their share of problems. First off, they were completely useless at night, which is kind of like having a phone that only works when you're standing on one foot and facing north. They also didn't work on cloudy days, which, if you know anything about medieval European weather, was pretty often. In places like England or northern France, you might as well have been using a chocolate teapot for all the good your sundial would do during those gray winter months. Every sundial had to be specifically designed for its exact location. Move a sundial even 50 miles north or south, and suddenly your lunch break is happening at breakfast time. Medieval merchants learned this the hard way. There are actually records of people complaining about sundials giving wrong times after being relocated. It's like having to recalibrate your watch every time you visit your grandmother. Some clever medieval folks tried to solve these problems by creating universal sundials that could be adjusted for different latitudes. These were basically the Swiss Army knives of medieval timekeeping. Complicated, expensive, and something you definitely show off to your neighbors. "Oh, this old thing? It's just my portable altitude-adjusted sundial with seasonal correction factors. No big deal." Medieval Islamic astronomers took sundial technology to a whole new level. They created sundials that could tell you not just the time, but also the direction of Mecca for prayers. These sophisticated designs eventually made their way to European markets, leading to some interesting cultural exchanges in timekeeping technology. The most expensive sundials were often decorated with elaborate artwork and inscriptions. One famous sundial from the 13th century was covered in gold leaf and had precious stones marking the hours. Talk about medieval bling! Some even included witty Latin phrases about the passing of time, like, "I mark only sunny hours." Medieval humor at its finest, folks. But here's something that really shows how important sundials were. Medieval universities actually employed official sundial keepers. These lucky folks had the prestigious job of maintaining and adjusting the university sundial. They were basically the IT department of the Middle Ages, except instead of resetting passwords, they were calculating solar angles and seasonal variations. There were even sundial instruction manuals written in medieval times. One particularly amusing text from the 12th century starts with what translates to, "First, ensure your sundial is not upside down." Apparently, even medieval tech support had to deal with user error. The manual goes on to provide increasingly complex instructions, probably causing just as much frustration as modern-day IKEA furniture assembly guides. The biggest flex in medieval times wasn't having the latest chariot or the fanciest sword. It was owning a super-accurate sundial. Wealthy merchants and nobles would commission increasingly elaborate designs, trying to one-up each other with fancier features. It was basically the medieval version of having the latest iPhone model before anyone else. While sundials were great when the sun was shining bright, medieval people needed something more reliable for those gloomy days and dark nights. That's where another clever invention came into play, one that didn't need the sun's cooperation at all. When the clouds rolled in and sundials became about as useful as a chocolate fire guard, medieval people turned to something a bit more reliable: water clocks, or as the fancy folks called them, clepsydras. The name comes from Greek words meaning water thief. Though, honestly, the only thing these devices stole was everyone's attention. The basic water clock worked kind of like an hourglass, except with water instead of sand. Drop by drop, water would flow from one container to another, with markings showing how much time had passed. It sounds simple, but some medieval engineers took this basic concept and turned it into the medieval equivalent of a Rube Goldberg machine. Take the most famous water clock ever built in medieval times, the one created by Al-Jazari in 1206. This thing wasn't just a clock, it was a full-on robot show. It had floating musicians, automatic doors, and even mechanical peacocks that would spread their tails every hour. Talk about showing off. It's like someone looked at a regular clock and said, "You know what this needs? Dancing puppets and birds that move by themselves?" Medieval water clocks came in all shapes and sizes. The smallest were portable devices used by scholars and physicians, while the largest were massive public installations that required entire rooms. One particularly impressive clock in a Damascus mosque used a series of containers that would tip over like dominoes throughout the day, creating a chain reaction of timekeeping. Each container would trigger the next one, and the whole system reset itself every 24 hours, assuming nobody bumped into it, that is. Medieval doctors used small water clocks to check patients' pulse rates. They'd count heartbeats while a specific amount of water dripped through their portable clock. It was basically a medieval fitness tracker minus the step counter and annoying notifications to stand up every hour. Some physicians got so good at this that they could diagnose illnesses based on how many water drops worth of heartbeats their patients had. The interesting thing about water clocks was that they worked at night, unlike their sun-dependent cousins. This was huge for medieval monks who needed to wake up for midnight prayers. Before water clocks, they had to rely on someone staying awake to watch the stars. Talk about a rough job. Brother John fell asleep during morning prayers again. Well, yeah, he was up all night staring at the sky. But water clocks had their own quirks. For one thing, water flows faster or slower depending on temperature, which means these clocks could run fast in summer and slow in winter. Medieval clock keepers had to constantly adjust the size of the water flow hole to compensate. It was like having to reprogram your digital clock, except instead of pushing buttons, you're fiddling with tiny holes while trying not to flood the monastery. Particularly clever medieval engineers created water clocks with automatic compensation systems. They'd add extra chambers and floats that would adjust the water flow based on pressure changes. These guys were basically the Silicon Valley engineers of their time, except instead of coding in Java, they were coding in H2O. One famous clock in Toledo even had a system of weighted floats that would automatically adjust the water flow rate as temperature changed. Medieval automation at its finest. The most sophisticated water clocks could divide the day into equal hours, a big deal when most people were still using temporal hours that changed length with the seasons. Imagine trying to schedule a meeting when an hour could be anywhere from 45 to 75 minutes, depending on the time of year. No wonder medieval people were always late to things. Records show that one particularly exasperated merchant wrote, "Met with the wool trader at the 3rd hour, which was apparently the 4th hour by his water clock and definitely the 5th hour by the town sundial." One of the biggest challenges with water clocks was keeping them running in freezing weather. Some medieval clock keepers got creative and started using wine instead of water in winter. This probably led to some interesting situations. Is the clock running fast, or have you been sampling the timekeeping fluid again? Records from one French monastery showed they switched to watered-down wine in winter months, leading to suspiciously frequent clock maintenance sessions. The maintenance of these clocks was a full-time job. Clock keepers had to regularly clean the pipes, adjust the flow rate, and top up the water. It was like being a cross between a plumber and a timekeeper. There are actual medieval records of clock keepers complaining about algae building up in the tubes. Apparently, even medieval job complaints included dealing with green gunk. One particularly amusing complaint from a 13th century clock keeper reads, "The water vessel grows more grass than the monastery garden." In some places, water clock maintenance became a family business, with the secrets of keeping these temperamental timepieces running being passed down from generation to generation. These families were like the medieval equivalent of tech support, except instead of telling people to turn it off and on again, they were adjusting water flows and cleaning out leaves from the intake pipes. Some medieval water clocks were so accurate that they only lost a few minutes per day. Pretty impressive for technology that's basically just controlled dripping. Compare that to those cheap digital watches that somehow lose 5 minutes every time you look away, and you've got to admire medieval engineering. While water clocks were great for indoor timekeeping, medieval people also needed a way to track time while traveling, especially at night. That's when they looked to the stars, using tools that would make any modern astronomy buff jealous. If water clocks were medieval smartphones, astrolabes were definitely their GPS systems. Talk about a Swiss Army knife of medieval gadgets. These beautiful brass instruments could tell time, navigate ships, measure the height of buildings, and even predict which stars would be visible on your birthday. The word astrolabe literally means star taker, but medieval people might as well have called it the show off your wealth and knowledge machine. Owning an astrolabe was like having the latest MacBook Pro and actually knowing how to use all its features. You weren't just rich, you were tech savvy. Medieval Islamic scholars absolutely dominated the astrolabe game. They made these devices so precise that they could measure angles down to 1 minute of arc. That's 1/60th of a degree. To put that in perspective, that's like being able to spot a penny from a football field away. The craftsmen who made these were basically the medieval equivalent of NASA engineers. One famous maker, Al-Zarqali, created an astrolabe so accurate it could track the motion of planets across the entire year. There are actual court records of astrolabe makers suing each other for copying designs. One guy in 13th century Baghdad got so mad about someone copying his special star pointer design that he took them to court. Medieval patent lawsuits, some things never change, right? The court records show he won his case and the copycat had to pay him in brass plates, which is kind of like getting paid in printer ink today. The really fun part about astrolabes was learning to use them. Medieval textbooks about astrolabes read like those instruction manuals where you're not sure if they're being serious or just messing with you. One famous manual starts with, "First, make sure you're holding it right side up. If the stars appear to be falling, you're doing it wrong." Medieval tech support at its finest. Another manuscript included a troubleshooting guide with gems like, If your calculations say the sun should rise at midnight, you've probably made a mistake. But getting your hands on an astrolabe wasn't easy. These things were expensive, like sell your cow and maybe your neighbor's cow too, expensive. A really good astrolabe could cost as much as a small house. There's a funny story about a medieval scholar who pawned his entire library just to buy one. His excuse? Books tell you about the stars, but an astrolabe shows you where they are. Try using that logic next time you want to buy something expensive. The coolest feature of medieval astrolabes was their ability to solve astronomical problems without any calculations. Want to know when the sun will rise tomorrow? Just twist the dial. Need to figure out how long until sunset? There's a setting for that. It was basically a medieval computer, complete with its own version of apps. Different metal plates you could swap in for different latitudes. Some advanced models even had interchangeable plates for different cities, making them the perfect tool for medieval travelers. Some particularly fancy astrolabes even had special features for determining the best times for medical procedures. Medieval doctors believed certain astronomical alignments were better for different treatments. Sorry, can't remove that tooth today. Mars is in retrograde. Come back next week. At least it was a better excuse than the computer system is down. Records show some physicians would charge extra for consultations that included astrolabe readings. Medieval upselling at its finest. The accuracy of these devices was mind-blowing. A skilled user could tell time within 15 minutes just by looking at the stars. Pretty handy when your water clock sprung a leak or your sundial was having a cloudy day. Medieval sailors used them to navigate across oceans, though you had to be pretty brave to trust your life to a brass disc while sailing through a storm. One captain's log from 1375 reads, "Astrolabe says we're near Spain. If wrong, blame the instrument maker." Some medieval scholars used them to calculate the times of sunrise and sunset for their entire year in advance. They'd create these amazing tables that looked like ancient spreadsheets. One astronomer supposedly spent 3 years making these calculations for his city, only to move to a different latitude and have to start all over again. Talk about a bad career move. But perhaps the most endearing thing about astrolabes was how personal they became to their owners. Many surviving astrolabes have little notes scratched into them. Things like check angle twice, or works better after midnight. One even has, if found, please return to Ahmad, will trade knowledge of stars for safe return, engraved on the back. Another has tick marks counting the number of correct predictions it made, like a medieval scorecard. The craftsmanship that went into making astrolabes was incredible. Each one was hand-engraved with intricate patterns, star maps, and mathematical scales. Some were even decorated with portraits of famous astronomers or mythological figures. It was like having a piece of art that could also tell you when to plant your crops or start your journey. While astrolabes were amazing for nighttime timekeeping, people needed something a bit simpler for indoor use, especially during those long winter nights. That's where another bright idea came in, one that literally lit up medieval timekeeping. Put down that fancy astrolabe and grab a candle. We're about to explore medieval time tracking at its most creative. Candle clocks were the original nightlights of the Middle Ages, except instead of keeping monsters away, they kept time. Well, mostly. The concept, pure genius in its simplicity. Take a candle, mark it with time intervals, light it up, and watch time melt away. Literally. These weren't your regular birthday candles either. Medieval candle clocks were serious business, often standing as tall as a person and thick as an arm. They were marked with metal pins that would drop into a metal plate below with a ping when each hour passed. Talk about an alarm clock that couldn't be snoozed. A properly made candle clock could be surprisingly accurate. The best ones, usually made from beeswax, could track time within 15 minutes over a full 8-hour period. That's not bad for something that's essentially a really tall birthday candle with attitude. Though there was always that one person who'd blow it out by accident and then try to convince everyone only 5 minutes had passed. Records from one monastery mention a novice monk who tried to hide his afternoon nap by replacing the burnt candle with a fresh one, the medieval equivalent of turning back the digital clock. The monks especially loved these things. They'd set up special prayer candles that would burn for exactly 4 hours, perfect for timing those middle-of-the-night prayer sessions. One monastery record from 1234 shows they went through over 2,000 timing candles in a single year. That's a lot of wax. The monk in charge of ordering supplies must have had some interesting conversations. "No, Brother Thomas, we can't use them for the Christmas service. These are for telling time." But making these candles was an art form all its own. You couldn't just grab any old candle and draw lines on it. The wax had to be perfectly mixed. The wick had to be just right. And don't even get me started on the importance of room temperature. Medieval candle makers who specialized in timing candles were like the Swiss watchmakers of their day, except with more burn marks on their aprons. Some even had secret recipes for their timing wax passed down through generations like a family pizza dough recipe. Some fancy candle clocks had different colored wax segments for different times of day. Red for morning prayers, white for midday, blue for evening. It was like a medieval mood lighting system. One particularly extra monastery had candles with scented wax sections. Lavender meant it was time for evening prayers, while pine meant morning prayers were coming up. Medieval aromatherapy meets timekeeping. But the graduated candle clocks are the clever devices that had notches cut at angles down the side, so as the candle burned down, it would burn faster or slower depending on the time of day. It was medieval daylight savings time, built right into the candle. Though I can't help but wonder how many important meetings were missed while they were perfecting that design. One merchant's diary complains about showing up to a meeting at the third notch, only to find everyone else had used different candles. Of course, these clocks weren't without their problems. A draft could make them burn unevenly. Humidity could mess with the burning rate, and don't even think about using them outside on a windy day. One medieval record tells of a merchant who tried to use a candle clock during a stormy night journey. He ended up 3 towns over by morning because his candle burned twice as fast in the wind. Medieval GPS fails. Some clever folks tried to solve these problems by putting their candle clocks in glass cases that no one could figure out how to light it. They ended up having to break the glass. Medieval tech support at its finest. The repair bill probably cost more than a year's worth of candles. But the best innovation had to be the water candle clock combo. Some genius figured out that you could put a candle clock in a container with a water clock as backup. If the candle went out, you still had the water clock. If the water clock leaked, you still had the candle. It was medieval redundancy planning, though maintaining 2 types of clocks probably gave the medieval timekeepers twice the headaches. But pricing these things was tricky. A good timing candle could cost you a day's wages, and you had to keep buying new ones. It was like having a subscription service for time itself. No wonder some people just stuck to counting their heartbeats or waiting for the church bells. One medieval account book shows a monastery spent more on timing candles than they did on food for a month. Talk about burning through your budget. And yet, despite all their quirks and costs, candle clocks remained popular throughout the Middle Ages. They were reliable enough for indoor use, simple enough for anyone to understand, and hey, they doubled as lighting. Plus, there was something oddly poetic about watching time literally melt away. Though I bet that poetry was lost on anyone who had to clean up all that melted wax every morning. And those church bells. Now, there's another story altogether. They were about to change the way entire towns kept time. Dong! There goes another hour. At least, that's what medieval folks hoped when they heard the church bells ring. Before alarm clocks and phone notifications drove everyone crazy, church bells were the ultimate social media platform of the Middle Ages. They didn't just tell time, they told everyone everything. Did you know that some medieval church bells were so loud they could be heard from 6 miles away? That's like getting a notification you can't swipe away. And trust me, medieval people had their own version of notification fatigue. One grumpy merchant wrote in 1342, "The bells ring so often, my chickens have stopped laying eggs out of pure spite." Each city had its own bell-ringing code, kind of like a medieval Morse code. 2 short rings might mean time for morning prayer, while 3 long rings could signal markets opening. The really fun part? Different churches sometimes got into bell wars, each trying to ring their bells louder than the others. Medieval noise pollution was apparently a real thing. Some towns even had to pass laws about when bells could and couldn't be rung, the medieval version of a noise ordinance. The job of bell ringer was no joke. These folks had to climb hundreds of steps multiple times a day in all weather just to ring the bells at the right time. And we're not talking about tiny dinner bells here. Some medieval church bells weighed over 2 tons. One bell ringer's log from 1386 complained, Pulled muscle in arm. Bell wins again. We'll try another arm tomorrow. The Angelus bell was the medieval equivalent of a lunch break notification. It rang at noon, and everyone was supposed to stop what they were doing and pray. Though records show some crafty merchants used this prayer break to sneak off to the tavern instead. One town council actually had to pass a law saying, "The Angelus bell means pray, not ale." Another document mentions a baker who claimed he couldn't hear the bells over his oven, though mysteriously he could always hear the tavern bells just fine. But different social classes had different relationships with the bells. Rich folks could ignore certain bells because they had their own timekeeping devices, while regular people organized their entire day around them. It was like having a premium ad-free subscription versus the free version with all the interruptions. One noble's diary reads, "The common folk run around like chickens when the bells ring. We prefer our water clock, much more dignified." The bells didn't just mark time, they marked life events. Wedding bells, funeral bells, fire bells, warning bells. Medieval people could tell what was happening in town just by listening to the rhythm and pattern of rings. One medieval writer noted, "A man could be born, married, and buried to the same bells, assuming he doesn't go deaf from all the ringing first." There were even special tax bells that rang when tax collectors were in town, probably the least popular ring pattern in history. They developed all sorts of tricks to protect their ears from stuffing them with wax to, get this, ringing the bells with their teeth. Yes, they'd bite down on a wooden rod connected to the bell rope. Talk about dedication to your job. Records show some bell ringers even passed their hearing loss down through generations, like a really unfortunate family tradition. The most impressive feat was coordinating multiple bells across a city. Imagine trying to get all the church bells in town to ring at exactly the same time without phones or watches. One medieval chronicle mentions a time when all the bells in London rang together to celebrate a royal birth, except for one church that was running late and rang their bells during the moment of silence that followed. Medieval awkwardness. Bell ringers had to be weather experts too. The bells sounded different in different weather conditions, and good ringers could actually predict storms by how their bells behaved. One bell ringer's diary from 1400 reads, "Bell sounds dull. Rain is coming. Best bring in the laundry and my neighbor's sheep that keep wandering into our yard. Also, Ralph still owes me money for last week's bell ringing lessons." The really fancy churches had something called a carillon, basically a whole orchestra of bells that could play actual tunes. Operating one was like playing a giant musical instrument, except every wrong note could be heard across the entire town. No pressure. One apprentice bell ringer wrote, "Tried to play Ave Maria. Townspeople say it sounded more like angry geese. Back to practicing. Master says I can try again when the birds stop flying away in terror." While the bells kept the community in sync with daily events, people still needed ways to track nature's bigger patterns. That's where medieval folks turned to something even more reliable than bronze bells: the natural world itself. Turns out Mother Nature was running a pretty tight ship when it came to keeping time, and medieval folks were experts at reading her signals. Take medieval farmers, for example. They could tell the time of year just by watching which flowers popped up in their fields. Dandelions were like little yellow alarm clocks saying, "Hey, time to plant your spring crops." These natural time tellers were so reliable that farmers actually named certain weeks after the flowers that bloomed then. Daffodil Week wasn't just a pretty name. It meant, get your gardening tools ready. This system was so detailed that different regions had their own flower calendars based on local blooming patterns. And it's really cool how medieval people figured out that certain flowers opened and closed at specific times of day. They called it the flower clock. Morning glory bloomed at dawn. Shocking, right? While evening primrose opened up just as the sun was setting. One particularly grumpy medieval gardener wrote in his journal, "The marigolds are running late again. Can't trust French flowers to keep proper English time. Going to replant with good British stock next spring." Animals were part of this natural timepiece too. Medieval farmers knew it was around 3 a.m. when their roosters started their first crow, though apparently medieval roosters weren't always the most reliable alarm clocks. One farmer's diary from 1389 complains, "Rooster overslept again," suspecting he was out late with the neighbor's hens. "Third time this week. Considering rooster soup for Sunday dinner, must find a replacement with better timekeeping skills and less interest in social life." Here's a fact that will interest you. Medieval beekeepers used their bees to tell time. They noticed that different flowers produce nectar at different times of day, and bees would change their flight patterns to match. Early morning, bees headed to the clover. Midday, off to the dandelions. One beekeeper's record shows he could tell time within 30 minutes just by watching which flowers his bees were visiting. Talk about a sweet way to track time. Some beekeepers got so good at this they could even predict rain by watching how their bees behaved. A particularly detailed beekeeper's journal from 1356 maps out the daily schedule of his hives with scary accuracy. Even cows got in on the timekeeping action. Medieval farmers noticed their cows would naturally head back to the barn for milking at almost exactly the same time every day. They were so regular you could set your sundial by them. Though one medieval dairy record notes, cows came in an hour late today. Blame the especially tasty grass in the north field. Must remember to rotate pastures based on punctuality rather than grass quality. Starting to suspect the cows are organizing some sort of protest against our current milking schedule. The changing seasons were like nature's calendar app. Medieval people tracked time through what they called agricultural moments, key events in the farming year that happened like clockwork. The first cuckoo's call meant spring planting should start. The arrival of swallows meant it was time to shear the sheep. One shepherd's notes read, "Birds are late this year. Sheep looking smugly over woolen. Starting to suspect they're spreading rumors about wolf sightings to delay shearing. Found mysterious claw marks on the barn door this morning. Clearly sheep-made." They even had a way to measure shorter time periods using plants. Water lilies were particularly good for this. They'd open their flowers for exactly 3 hours each morning. Medieval monks actually planted them in their garden ponds to help time their morning prayers. Though there's a funny story about one monastery where all the water lilies bloomed at different times because someone planted them facing different directions. The head gardener's note reads, "Brother Thomas insists the flowers are fine. We're just in different time zones. Suspect he's been sampling too much communion wine. Have assigned him to bell-ringing duty instead. At least the bells don't grow in the wrong direction." Some of these natural timekeepers were incredibly accurate. Studies have shown that certain medieval farming schedules, based entirely on natural signs, only varied by about 2 days across 100 years. That's more accurate than some modern weather forecasts. Medieval farmers could predict the start of spring within a 3-day window just by watching which birds returned and when certain trees started budding. One agricultural manual from 1401 lists over 400 different natural signs used for timing various farming activities. Medieval people also used other people's body clocks to keep time. They knew most folks got hungry around the same time each day, so hunger time became a real measurement. Meet me at hunger time was a totally normal way to schedule lunch. Though one medieval cook complained, "Lord Geoffrey's hunger time comes 3 times before everyone else's. Makes meal planning rather difficult. Starting to think he's just using it as an excuse to raid the pantry. Have begun hiding the good cheese behind the pickled herrings." But nature didn't just help medieval people track hours and seasons, it also helped them spot danger coming. Birds suddenly going quiet often meant a storm was approaching, while cows lying down in the field meant rain was on the way. One farmer wrote, "When the sheep huddle together, either rain is coming or the neighbor's dog is loose again." Usually, both. Today, they're huddling and looking guilty, suspect they've eaten through the vegetable garden again. Wife suggests we start a betting pool on which excuse is correct each time. Speaking of spotting things coming, medieval communities needed ways to track time that didn't involve staring at flowers all day. That's where they turned to some specially trained experts. Forget Doctor Who. Medieval professional timekeepers were the real time lords. They had just one job: make sure everyone in town knew what time it was. Simple, right? Not when your most reliable tool might be a leaky water clock or a sleepy rooster. These folks went by many titles: horologists, time criers, bell ringers, or as one grumpy medieval document puts it, those noisy fellows who won't let anyone sleep past dawn. It was a high-pressure job, literally in the case of water clock keepers who had to maintain the right water pressure all day long, adjusting the flow as temperatures changed and cleaning out debris that could throw off their measurements. The best timekeepers were treated like rock stars in their communities. One timekeeper in York was paid more than the town's doctor. Though to be fair, the doctor's patients only complained if they died, while everyone complained if dinner was served late. Records show one timekeeper got a bonus of 2 chickens and a wheel of cheese for being accurate for a whole month straight. The town records note, worth every bird and bite. No one has been late to church for 4 whole weeks, considering adding a goose if he can keep it up through winter. But being a professional timekeeper wasn't all about counting hours. These folks had to be part mathematician, part astronomer, and part diplomat. Try telling an important merchant that he's late for a meeting when his own sundial, which he installed wrong, says he's early. One timekeeper's diary reads, Lord William insists it's not time for his taxes because his rooster hasn't crowded. Rooster mysteriously stopped crowing 3 weeks ago. Suspicious. Found feathers in his kitchen yesterday. Playing dumb. Will add an extra hour to his tax time as compensation for attempted time fraud. Town criers had it particularly rough. They had to walk around shouting the time every hour in all weather. One medieval record shows a crier caught a cold and his voice dropped so low that everyone thought it was 3 hours later than it actually was. The entry reads, John's voice finally recovered. Town schedule is back to normal. Baker, particularly relieved, was tired of serving lunch at breakfast time. The tavern keeper was less pleased, was enjoying the extra evening hours, have suggested John practice his calls before each round to avoid future confusion. Some towns had multiple timekeepers who were supposed to coordinate with each other. You can guess how well that worked out. There are actual court records of arguments between timekeepers about whose time was the real time. One document from 1378 describes 2 timekeepers getting into a fistfight over whether noon had arrived yet. The judge's verdict? Both fined 1 penny for behaving like children. Also, it's clearly past noon now anyway. Court adjourned for lunch, and no, we won't be using either of their times to decide when court resumes. The job came with some weird responsibilities, too. In some towns, timekeepers had to track beer time, the official hours when taverns could serve drinks. This led to some creative conflict resolution. One record notes, the tavern owner claims it's not closing time because his cat hasn't done its evening wash yet. Timekeeper responded by bringing in 3 other cats who all agreed it was definitely past closing. Dispute ended when all the cats spotted a mouse and left the premises. Have decided to stick to sundials and water clocks, less prone to chasing mice. Here's a fact. Some medieval timekeepers were so respected that they could legally wake up anyone in town, including nobility. One account tells of a timekeeper who regularly threw pebbles at the local lord's window to wake him for morning prayers. The lord couldn't complain because it was technically part of the timekeeper's official duties. Talk about job security. The same account mentions the lord trying to bribe the timekeeper with gold to lose track of time during dawn prayers. It didn't work. The timekeeper's response? Time waits for no man, my lord, not even one with a heavy purse. But the most stressful part is having to adjust everyone's sense of time when the seasons change. Medieval hours weren't fixed like ours. They changed length with daylight. A summer hour could be much longer than a winter hour. One timekeeper wrote, tried explaining to the baker why his bread-making hour is shorter now. He threw a loaf at me. At least it wasn't fully baked this time. Have suggested he count by loaves instead of hours. He's considering it. Meanwhile, the miller insists his grinding hours should stay the same length all year. Explained that's not how the sun works. He remains unconvinced. The really dedicated timekeepers would create detailed records of their methods. Some of these survive today, and they're hilarious. One from 1392 includes the note, for accurate morning time, count the baker's snores. When they stop, it's dawn. Unless it's Sunday, he sleeps in and throws off the whole system. Have started paying his apprentice to wake him up. Cost, 1 small pie per week. Worth it. Must remember to specify the filling next time. The apprentice claims rhubarb counts as fruit. And when timekeepers made mistakes, those stories are legendary. One town's records show they celebrated New Year's Eve twice in 1387 because the timekeeper lost track of the days. Instead of admitting the mistake, he convinced everyone the first celebration was actually for Old Year's Eve and started a new tradition. The town liked it so much they kept doing it for years until a new timekeeper arrived and was thoroughly confused about why everyone celebrated New Year's twice. The tradition only ended when someone finally did the math and realized they were gradually shifting the whole calendar year backwards. But while these dedicated timekeepers were struggling to tell people when to eat lunch, medieval society as a whole was pulling off some truly feats of coordination. Take cathedral building, for example. These weren't just big churches, they were massive construction projects that took decades to complete. And somehow they managed to coordinate hundreds of workers without a single digital project management tool. Instead, they used a fascinating system songs. Yes, songs. Workers would time their lifting and moving of heavy stones to specific chants and rhythms. One construction record from 1347 notes. Master Mason insists workers sing slower, stones moving too fast, causing wall alignment issues. Choir master was offended. Architectural dispute turned into a musical crisis. The military timing was even more impressive. Medieval armies could coordinate attacks across huge distances using a combination of flags, horns, and prearranged signals. One battle account describes how an army timed their attack based on when a specific bird usually started its morning song. The commander's log reads, "Bird sang late today." Entire battle plan was delayed. Note for future, have a backup bird. They even developed a sophisticated system of beacon fires that could send messages across hundreds of miles in just a few hours. Medieval builders could predict almost exactly how long it would take for mortar to dry in different weather conditions. They didn't have humidity meters or temperature gauges. They just knew from experience and careful observation. One builder's manual has this gem. If a cat can walk on the mortar without sinking, it's ready for the next layer. If a cat refuses to walk on it, find a braver cat. Their shipping coordination was just as remarkable. Ports would schedule dozens of ships arriving and departing using nothing but tide tables and weather patterns. One harbor master's log from 1389 shows they successfully managed 47 ships in one day using just the height of waves and the position of seabirds as timing guides. Though there is one funny entry, 3 ships arrived early. Blamed it on enthusiastic wind. Suspect they just can't read tide markers. Medieval universities had their own impressive timing systems too. They could coordinate classes across multiple buildings using a combination of bells, sand clocks, and student messengers. One professor's diary complains, "Students claim they were late because the philosophy building's bells are running slow." Suspect they were just at the tavern. Must coordinate with bell ringer and tavern keeper. But perhaps the most remarkable success story was how they managed to brew beer with surprisingly consistent timing. Without thermometers or precise clocks, medieval brewers could time their brewing stages perfectly using just touch, sight, and sound. One brewery record states, when the master brewer's bald head stops steaming when he bends over the vat, it's ready for the next stage. Hey, whatever works. All these successes came from something we've kind of lost today. The ability to read and work with nature's own rhythms. While we're all staring at our phones, medieval folks were reading the sky, the plants, and the animals around them. Sure, they might not have been able to tell you it was exactly 3:47 p.m., but they could tell you exactly when the tide would turn, when the storm would hit, and when the bread would be perfectly baked. Maybe they were onto something with their more flexible approach to time. After all, their cathedrals are still standing. Their trade routes worked for centuries, and their brewing recipes are still used today. Not bad for people who thought quarter past sunrise was a precise enough meeting time.